I know the National Council on Severe Autism can't get enough of that smooth taste, but it's time Jill and her friends realize that regardless of anyone's opinion on the validity of self-diagnosis of autism, they need to stop sucking ass long enough to realize that not only do words actually mean things, but that their obsession with using self-diagnosis as an excuse to defame autistic people they personally don't care about demolishes any credibility they have as an autism advocacy nonprofit, especially one that accepts charitable donations from the public and wants to influence laws that will impact the lives of autistic people. If you're new to my series, I want to make sure you know that about an hour and 20 minutes into my previous barrier aggression video, that being part 14, I said this. It really does seem like throughout this podcast episode, you and your friends want to create the impression in your audience's mind that a clinical diagnosis of autism whose characteristics describe a relatively high capability for independent functionality with relatively minimal external support requirement, keyword being requirement, is therefore tantamount to a bad faith amateur self-diagnosis devoid of a professional involvement and credibility as a legitimate disability. That's something I've said in various ways throughout my entire series about the NCSA's podcast. These people consistently dismiss and deny the validity of self-identification of autism, yet they consistently treat clinically diagnosed autistic people that they call high-functioning as though their diagnoses were tantamount to self-identification, and then hold them in public contempt for calling themselves autistic, for being part of the disability community, and for accessing disability support services. You don't need to endorse the self-identification of autism to understand why this is a fantastically farcical double standard.
And that does do a disservice to those who have, I guess, more classic or more true forms of autism.
They have to agree. So, that's exactly the issue. I don't see a problem with some people identifying their differences or leaving themselves neurodivergent. It's fine. We all have our little quirks and our little differences, and that's fine. However, the use of the word autism, it's taken to the extremes because we need it for policymaking, for accessing services, for accessing education.
Amongst a lot of professionals, I think that Carmen and I are probably a lot more willing than others to speak out, speak the truth. But many people are not because they don't want to be canceled. And they don't want to get in trouble. People do need to have a little bit more guts in terms of speaking up and standing for the truth. But it's hard. It is definitely hard because nobody is really protected, and we do live in a society where ultimately identity cannot be touched, and people are able to claim whatever identity they want.
This flagrant hypocrisy is one of my main grievances with the NCSA's hate group tier bullshit that they claim to be autism advocacy. But throughout my series until now, I've always had to frame it strictly in the hypothetical by saying things like, it seems like they feel this way about high-functioning autistic people, or it creates the impression that they could feel this way about high-functioning autistic people, because I feel like in spite of how elaborately they have expressed opinions along these lines, I've still, had the sense that there is a certain element of plausible deniability in which they could say that the NCSA didn't actually think that about high-functioning autistic people, as they call us, that professional diagnosis of what they called high-functioning autism wasn't also a form of self-identification of autism. Well, I gave them that leeway, and 30 minutes after I made the statement in the previous video I just replayed, I, in a genuinely unscripted surprise to myself, discovered a Facebook post from the official NCSA Facebook account that literally described official diagnosis of high-functioning autism in adults to be a form of self-diagnosis. I don't even have to frame this hypothetically anymore. The NCSA actually published this in their official communication channels, and now I get to talk about how full of shit they are. Let's get started. Hi, I'm Super Train Station H, and welcome to part 15 of Barrier Aggression, in which the National Council on Severe Autism and their podcast series Autism Confidential suck ass super bad. Last time, I made a countdown list of stupid things NCSA members and allies have said. As I was filming the final stages of editing that video, I unexpectedly discovered this, and I can't believe it's real. I mean, really, look at this shit. The National Council on Severe Autism posted this on their actual official Facebook page. I mean, really, seriously, look at this. Pause it if you have to. And if you're listening to this with audio only, I'll explain it. But whether you're actually looking at your screen right now or not, it's no secret that forefront NCSA members have outspokenly derided the self-identification of autism, a point which I have yet to actually comment on in my series in regards to my personal feelings. But the principle of the obvious farcical invalidity of self-identification of autism drives a lot of NCSA rhetoric, in which they intend to stand up for real and valid struggles of high support needs, aka lower functioning autistic children, as they would call them. Now, if you want proof of their feeling this way about autistic self-diagnosis, watch the earlier videos in my series, because I have plenty of receipts in video form in which the NCSA and their allies consider what they call self-diagnosis and self-identification of autism to be one of the main things they're fighting against. Though keep in mind, in a lot of these clips, they are specifically talking about people who are known to be clinically diagnosed.
We can prevent the negatives, especially in terms of self-diagnosis. Like, self-diagnosis is fraught with limitations, and anybody can diagnose themselves based on social difficulties as having autism.
Not only diagnosed with autism by professionals, but also self-diagnosed and have adopted autism. It's become almost like faddish to for individuals who have the types of challenges that are described in that article to adopt the term of, to identify as being autistic.
And sometimes a lot of these people who are autistic are self-diagnosed. Some of the people who are most vocal, right, in the autism community have just...
Oftentimes we can find ourselves in a situation of blind acceptance of identity over reality, which again is so frustrating because nowhere else in medicine do we experience the same. No cancer patient would want to grade or stage his own tumor based on his personal preference or his feelings or his identity.
Well, what we have here is our main exhibit in part 15 of Barrier Aggression, is an NCSA Facebook post which explains in less than a dozen words of the sort of a larger message that the NCSA maintains a definition of self-identification of autism that literally includes autistic adults who are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder by a professional clinician following a personal evaluation. Now, I know the phrase self-identification can take on a number of different connotations depending on the context. I personally have used it in my own video scripts to describe autistic people who I make very clear are professionally diagnosed, but who elect to describe themselves using terms that are not formally recognized for official diagnostic purposes. But in the sense the NCSA and its allies are using it, especially in this particular Facebook message, given their firmly established stance against the self-diagnosis of autism, and the fact that NCSA personalities and allies routinely use the phrase self-identification to very clearly mean self-diagnosis without professional involvement, the fact that the NCSA now are explicitly stating that they consider the self-identification of autism to include people with professional diagnosis, if the person in question is an adult and able to communicate so as to explain themselves as being autistic, it very explicitly establishes a perspective in which the NCSA considers any person capable of describing themselves as autistic to therefore not be legitimately autistic. And then, further down, the NCSA Facebook post draws an equivalency between being an adult diagnosed with autism who is able to describe themselves as such as being equivalent to not meeting the criteria to have an autism diagnosis in the first place. I mean, the NCSA president has explicitly said that on camera already, but Seeing it written out like this, I can't even personally pin this on Jill at this point, whether she actually wrote this post herself or not. Now, I know the NCSA thinks they're crusading against some woke preteen keyboard warriors on TikTok and Tumblr who are facetiously appropriating autism as a quirky fad, maybe proclaiming themselves to be cyber-new type Palladian starseeds cloned from cat DNA using technology passed down from the ancient empire of Atlantis. But as an autistic rabbit-eared dogman from the moon, I can tell you from personal experience that that's bullshit. And even prominent personalities within the neurodiversity community have spoken critically against that sort of thinking as harmful to disability rights and advocacy overall. But while neurodiversity proponents challenge harmful ideas from people who believe themselves to be allies of the neurodiversity movement by saying these things, the NCSA here is fighting those same bad ideas by blaming us for saying these things which we don't even approve of, using words and actions and publishing messages that explicitly target disabled people of many descriptions for ridicule, distrust, and exclusion from the autism space, including, of course, people like me. Autistic people like me, who Jill Escher specifically has used NCSA resources to describe as moderately functioning at best in her own published descriptions of the autism spectrum on the NCSA's website when it comes to black and white ink and paper diagnostic profiles of autistic traits and coinciding characteristics and difficulties worthy of disability support services. People like me, who Jill herself has even described as being overlooked and ignored by the neurodiversity paradigm. Once again, in terms of my ink and paper description of diagnostic characteristics formulated by professionals in a university setting. Yet in spite of all of that, that same Jill Escher would quite certainly dismiss me and many of us as non-disabled, quirky, autism-appropriating nerds when she actually needs to see our faces or read or hear our stories as told by ourselves and has to deal with us as part of the disability community. Meaning people like me, who NCSA leaders, without having fucking met us, go around whistleblowing about, saying that we can't possibly deserve to be considered disabled at all, let alone severely disabled. And to that end, host guests claiming that autistics they call high functioning actually have, quote unquote, deep personality disorders.
As many neurodiversity proponents that claim to be autistics are really not autistics. Okay, and some of them have really deep personality disorders. And
is there anything in the book that could be applied instead of autism, some kind of personality disorder, maybe?
And are interfering with services and special education that we don't need. Resources that are for the so described lower functioning children and patients of NCSA members and allies to benefit from.
I don't see a problem with some people identifying their differences or labeling themselves neurodivergent. It's fine. We all have our little quirks and our little differences, and that's fine. However, the use of the word autism, it's taken to the extremes because we need it for policymaking, for accessing services, for accessing education.
People saying these things about us and making these accusations about us don't know us at all, don't know at what age we spoke our first words, if at all, don't know at what age we learned to tie our own shoes, if at all, don't know or care if some of us present as relatively normal seeming to them. Because of services and developmental therapy, training, and other help we received only because we were formally determined to require assistance for severe and sustained clinically significant impairments within the range of pervasive developmental disorders, or neurodevelopmental disorders, known in 2025 as autism spectrum disorder, which, by the way, even by the standards of 30 fucking years ago, that absolutely did include the former Asperger's syndrome, which I remind you is an obsolete classification, which certain NCSA members and allies want to present as never having been a valid disability in the first place, in spite of the phrase severe and sustained clinically significant impairment literally being in the opening description of the former Asperger's definition. Now, I knew this was a problem with the NCSA, but this Facebook post really puts it over the top to me. So honestly, screw you guys. It's really over at this point in terms of me playing devil's advocate for you assholes. And you might not believe it, but I wrote so many avenues of plausible deniability within these videos of mine to leave open the even slightest possibility that I was simply misunderstanding or misinterpreting NCSA messages to have the worst implications possible. Perhaps I was just fishing for things to get upset over. And the fact that I held my own possible personal bias as a concern throughout this project until now is highly ironic, because I'm not fucking kidding. When I started doing research for the now abandoned project that later turned into barrier aggression as you're watching it now, I was, up until right now, writing these videos with the intent of making the case that the explicit prejudice and bigotry within the NCSA towards autistic people who are able to communicate without oversight or control from the NCSA was something restricted to a handful of extremists within the group, specifically Jill Escher and certain of her podcast guests, and NCSA board member Dr. Lee Wachtel, and that the other members of leadership might have been too busy actually trying to help high support needs autistic people to realize that Jill and Lee were undermining the messages of people like Vice President Dr. Amy Lutz, who has, in the past, made statements that the NCSA respected the legitimacy of autistic self-advocacy. Statements that NCSA Executive Director Jackie Renee has used to argue that autistic self-advocates and high-functioning autistic people should trust and love the NCSA.
Sure, there are autistic people who are concert pianists and college graduates and Eagle Scouts, as NCSA's VP noted. We celebrate them. We are happy for them. But their success doesn't erase our children's challenges. We're not asking for pity. We're not attacking anyone's identity.
But now, with this Facebook post, even if it's just one rogue member putting up this message describing the clinical diagnosis of autistic adults other than those the NCSA cares about as a form of self-identification of autism, and no one else stepping in to maybe question or challenge that message, at least not that I could see by the time I encountered this post, I can't even keep up this act of leaving open even the slightest possibility that the NCSA isn't somehow a fucked up group that exists to promote hate and distrust toward autistic people who they happen not to have total control over. And in all honesty, like real originally, when I first started doing the preliminary research for the now abandoned different project that became barrier aggression as you're seeing it now, I started this project with the intention of challenging autistic self-advocates who I felt were presenting out-of-context quotes from the NCSA so as to misleadingly present them as evil. I actually wanted to make a counterpart to the 2024 video I did about an irate autism attack mom named Amber on Buck Angel's podcast. I originally wanted to make a video revolving around the truth that even if I or the autistic community didn't like or agree with the NCSA, that it was still important to represent the views and experiences of people we disagree with honestly and rationally, and to consider perspectives other than our own. And my motivations in making that original video, as I had once intended to, go much deeper than that in ways I'll keep to myself for the time being, unless Jill and her friends force my hand, which I hope doesn't happen. And you know what's really funny? This post from the NCSA is so extreme that I have reason to believe that even Amber who I spoke about for 4 hours about how wrong and toxic her misconceptions of lower support needs, aka higher functioning autism, were, would disagree with the NCSA's Facebook post.
You could say whatever the hell you want and you get to be treated as you want. No, in order for you to get some kind of help and some kind of hope, there needs to be something on the books, but it shouldn't be everybody who thinks that they have this or think that they have something be able to distinguish it. Right, exactly.
I mean, whether or not I or anyone else agree with her, Amber is specific. She is complaining about the self-identification of autism without professional involvement as inherently illegitimate, and that people should be evaluated by a clinician in a professional environment before making such claims. There's a lot I would challenge her on in regards to some of the practical realities of her ideals, but we have a situation where, based on what Amber said back then, the NCSA's definition on the so-called self-ID of autism are too extreme even for Amber, and that's saying something. As for the NCSA's Facebook post, autism at its core, though it is of course like a matter of individual perspective, is clinically described at its base level as a confluence of communication disabilities. I mean, people assume that because I can use spoken language most of the time, and the way that I'm able to present publicly with preparation, that I must not have communication problems and therefore must not be disabled. But people can't see the hours of classes and therapy and training I needed to do a lot of basic normal things like carry on dynamic, unscripted, and yet linearly logical interactions with other people. Even those sorts of interactions of a completely trivial and non-consequential nature that can mostly seem kind of normal at least some of the time. Interactions that are, to this day, as complex as a blindfolded juggling act to me that I've gotten very good at, but still take considerable effort, and yet that are as effortless as blinking or breathing for other people. And I know Jill is obsessed with calling those formally acknowledged autistic characteristics quirky rather than disabling.
How is it that somebody who is extremely capable, extremely competent, I'm sure she is quirky, but why in the world does that have to be labeled autism? I don't get it.
You do have some people who are very quirky socially and have some slight sensory and behavioral challenges, and they might be diagnosed with autism. They might be fully functional, independent adults. They might have college degrees. They might have successful careers. They might be married. They might have children, but they might be given the same diagnosis as my nonverbal children who can't read. Strong adaptive abilities, but have kind of social quirks, are in the same category, the same diagnostic category as my kids who are nonverbal.
And she loves using Sheldon from Big Bang Theory as an exemplar of my allegedly trivialized DSM-5 era disability-free autism, going as far as to use Sheldon in her so-called reality check presentations about autism.
So I'm here today to talk about 5 things you really should know about autism, but maybe not the things that you tend to hear all the time in the media. This is the reality check version. Number 1, autism is not a superpower. Now, if you watch hit TV shows, or if you're on Tumblr or TikTok or these things I'm too old to be on, you've probably heard things like autism is a gift, autism is a strength, autism is a superpower, autism is just diversity.
But aside from the fact that Sheldon isn't even said to be autistic or disabled on the actual show, it's not cute or silly when neighbors think I'm abusing drugs because of tics or stimming, or when a medical doctor refuses to provide me with treatment for chronic digestive problems where I can't keep food down because they don't feel like I'm explaining my symptoms in a trustworthy seeming way, or when I have to consciously deploy tactics I learned in social skills counseling to go, mostly unnoticed, and avoid negative attention in public spaces where I actually am supposed to be. Tactics I later learned were also used by spies, by actual, literal wartime infiltration agents. There's no laugh track. Playing back when I was obsessed with getting a job and pushing my own back towards self-reliance before my parents were even asking me to attempt to earn for myself, only for my favorite bookstores and computer shops with now hiring signs to turn me away over the doctor-prescribed sensory glasses I used to need to wear at all times to provoke stroke-like headaches, or because something seemed just off to them in a way they couldn't put their finger on. Only for them to hire my non-disabled friends who had a fraction of the literary or computer knowledge that I had, let alone the work ethic. Now, I had friends I received disability services alongside whose voices I've never heard, and not just people I was around sometimes or in the same building or classroom with sometimes, but people I looked forward to seeing every day and hanging out with after school, not at the mall, but in the same support room we got services in. What normal high school classroom for non-disabled students has sinks for the students with drooling problems to wash their hands in, and crash mats in case someone has a seizure? I've seen those things, and yet NCSA supporters like to use them as examples of things falsely autistic people like me, by Lee Wachtel's implication, can't possibly understand or empathize with.
And that does do a disservice to those who have, I guess, more classic or more true forms of autism.
With that ignorance, according to Lee, being epitomized by the fact that disabled people, other than her own patients, dared to collaborate to create their own symbols to represent their own community, symbols that had meaning to them being us.
And these are some things that I sometimes call like advocacy luxuries.
Lee used the NCSA podcast to applaud her college-age children for challenging their autistic college classmates for discussing their experiences and perspectives as autistic people, saying that if they were really autistic, they would closely resemble Lee's patients at her inpatient neurobehavioral unit at the Kennedy Krieger Institute, which is a hospital for disabled children.
And I think it's particularly, a lot of these issues with like identity and cancellation and this new stuff that we've had to deal with in the United States are particularly driven by like the younger generation, who I think like really has very little to no knowledge of what autism really can look like unless they've had like a family member who has the type of autism that Kenner like initially described. I've seen that in my own kids who are very familiar with my work and in their college experiences, listening to stuff about neurodiversity and I have autism. I think that my middle son said it best, I don't see any gift in needing to wear like a hockey helmet all day so you don't smash your head in. But that's not the reality that most people see.
Meanwhile, I've had autistic friends in college who are far more involved in autism advocacy and activism than me, who due to coinciding health conditions and struggles in self-care aren't even alive anymore. But Jill calls me and my friends super privileged, and that we're on the high end of autism, like it's some fucking luxury item that we chose to make a statement for ourselves.
So the people at that very, very high end of autism who are super privileged, right?
Just to interject real quick, we do talk about a spectrum. We typically we recognize. I mean, certainly in my office, in my interaction with my colleagues, we do recognize that there is a vast spectrum of autism. Is that what you're talking about?
That's why I find it so personally fucking offensive that I started learning as much as I could about the NCSA so that I could argue that neurodiversity proponents who often clash with that group's sensibilities should still try to understand them without judgmental preconceptions and present even ideas of theirs that we disagree with honestly and calmly. My reward for attempting this even-handed approach was to be confronted with so much obviously egregious malicious bullshit that I instead now feel as though many within the self-advocacy community of autism have been too fixated on beating up on the dead horse that is Autism Speaks to pay proper attention to the NCSA, which I sincerely believe is doing much more harm right now than Autism Speaks ever did, only to go unnoticed in comparison, since fortunately, unlike Autism Speaks, the NCSA sucks at self-promotion.
But yeah, I mean, I think this has been one of the great debacles of autism, right? That, you know, people who are cognitively, have strong cognitive abilities, strong communication abilities, strong adaptive abilities, but have kind of social quirks, are in the same category, the same diagnostic category as my kids who are nonverbal and function like at a preschool level.
And
like,
that's a problem.
It's absurd. It's not just a problem. I mean, it's violently absurd. It's radically absurd.
Now, it's no secret that I've clearly been pissed off and sardonic throughout my videos to this point, but no matter how hyperbolically pissed I've been, I've maintained what I felt to be a benchmark of responsibility. That's why at the start of every barrier aggression video, I have an on-screen message warning my viewers not to contact anyone I criticize. I also made a point out of respecting the relationships between NCSA members and their own disabled children. And if you don't believe me on that, watch episode 14 of my series, and you'll notice how for item 25 on my countdown list, I did not play condescending music over NCSA Executive Director Jackie Renee discussing the custodianship of her daughter, and I didn't criticize Jackie's custodianship. What I criticized was the NCSA as a whole, only accepting the legitimacy of messages published by autistic people who either openly endorse the NCSA policy positions and rhetoric, or who were, one way or another, under the complete control of NCSA members in terms of their ability to communicate with the non-autistic world. And I'll be honest, well, I mean, I've been honest this entire time, but no matter how suboptimal some of their terminology choices might seem to the neurodiversity community, for me personally, if the National Council on Severe Autism's criticism of online autism discourse and autism discourse in the media was limited to criticism of the trivialization of autism and just framing autism as a description of hypercapability and savant talents while losing any context of struggle or disability, or if the NCSA had been focused on criticizing a very real online element that does, at times, reduce autism to a quirky aesthetic defined by STEM toys and glitter putty, while rejecting descriptions or depictions of difficulty or suffering, even when shared by autistic people themselves, I might have still certain criticisms of the NCSA, but I certainly would not have made more than 15 hours worth of videos that essentially no one has watched, explicating to the subatomic level how full of shit these people are. I wouldn't be questioning at what point it becomes reasonable to describe them as a possible hate group, which is something that I've been extremely wary about saying about Autism Speaks for years, no matter how fashionable it may be to do that among neurodiversity proponents. And I don't even like the fact that I'm in a position where I have to examine people who are organizing on behalf of radically vulnerable, disabled, and disadvantaged family members and ask how many of them, those caretakers, thanks to Jill and her NCSA's rhetoric, see me and my friends, some of whom have been struggling with suicidal ideation since elementary school due to natural challenges and societal consequences of disability, as being an enemy faction that's impersonating disability as a fetish, according to Lee Wachtel, and conspiring to conceal and censor the struggles of their children and steal their resources.
become it's sadly almost like faddish to for individuals who have the types of challenges that are described in that article to adopt the term of, to identify as being autistic. And I think that in sharp contrast to many patients with autism, particularly the ones that Dr. Lopez and I work with, autism had taken on kind of this character of like almost like a fantasy, like, a gift, like it's special to be this way. And, you bring something like special and unique to the world that other people don't have. And it's become kind of cool and interesting to be neurodivergent. And it seems that a lot of people, rather than perhaps looking more deeply at the crux of the issues that they're experiencing, have happily taken on this moniker of autism as something that explains the challenges that they feel that they have, and that they can also like pawn off as like a very positive thing. And that does do a disservice to those who have, I guess, more classic or more true forms of autism.
Hey kid, you're a stupid little fucker.
And Jill Escher, president of the NCSA, literally said that the existence of people like me within the ASD diagnostic space and the autism community is a violent absurdity against her autistic children.
It's absurd. It's not just a problem. I mean, it's violently absurd. It's radically absurd.
Her simply saying that makes life more difficult and less safe for people like me. How am I supposed to believe that the policies being pushed by a national organization led by this person aren't also intended to make my life more difficult and less safe? And regardless of that message from Jill, there's already organized harassment and bigotry against autistic people like me, because some think that we're stealing the struggles of people those like NCSA board member Dr. Lee Wachtel says have, in her words, true autism, a phrase which I remind you has zero scientific or academic validity, while Wachtel's colleague rants about how the existence of autistic people other than those most outwardly resembling the children and patients of NCSA members supposedly interferes with the ability for the NCSA's preferred autistic children and patients to receive disability support services, as though people outside of that description couldn't possibly legitimately qualify for disability supports.
I don't see a problem with some people identifying their differences or labeling themselves neurodivergent. It's fine. We all have our little quirks and our little differences, and that's fine. However, the use of the word autism, it's taken to the extremes because we need it for policymaking, for accessing services, for accessing education.
We've been qualified for those supports for decades before the publication of the DSM-5 that's been the bane of the NCSA's existence for describing people like me that they disapprove of as being called autistic. The DSM-5 that's the crux of the NCSA's arguments about the trivialization of autism due to it including people like us who, according to them, who haven't fucking met us, can't possibly be disabled. And I mean, honestly, after all I've gone through to get to this point, it is incredibly wild that the tipping point for how much bullshit I was willing to accept from the NCSA would be this Facebook post. Because the NCSA wrote that post in relation to their criticizing a third-party news article that I actually think could have been worthy of a critical examination. The NCSA's feathers were ruffled by an article that possibly downplays the aspect of disordered communication in relation to autism. I refuse to read the article because the merits of the article don't matter now, and I think the NCSA, based on their treatment of the Spectrum News article about autistic doctors, deserves zero fucking trust in truthfully presenting third-party articles about autistic people. But if I were to assume that the NCSA's explanation of that article's message was accurate, that message would potentially draw into question the hours of therapy and counseling I went through that allowed me, with ongoing effort and ongoing impairment, to function as well as I do today. I've actually directly debated this point to other autistic self-advocates, not online, but in person, that certain opinions, while trying to reduce the ongoing problem that is the stigma linked to autism of all support needs levels, it actually endangers the continued availability of necessary supports, which are already at a critical scarcity for those who would benefit from the least resource-intensive supports, let alone those of us in need of daily, perpetual, and lifelong support solutions that somehow someone needs to pay for. Now, if this article actually does seek to minimize the association of communication impairment, social learning disorder aspects of the autism spectrum, I would be opposed to that, and I can make hours of videos explaining why. But the National Council on Severe Autism has zero fucking credibility in making that case, especially when they do so as propaganda to further invalidate the clinical legitimacy of so-called high-functioning autism, on the basis that we don't actually have clinically significant communication impairments as described in the Autism Spectrum Disorder Diagnosis featured in DSM-5, and therefore we shouldn't be calling ourselves autistic, including those with a clinical diagnosis of ASD. The NCSA is full of shit for complaining about this article, in which so-called self-identified autistic people allegedly downplay the presence of communication problems as a keystone autistic characteristic. Because when we do get interviewed in articles where we specifically discuss severe communication problems that disrupt our day-to-day functionality to the point that professional clinicians get involved, perform personalized evaluations on us, and give us communication-related disorder diagnoses like autism, NCSA President Jill Escher uses that opportunity to complain that those aren't autistic characteristics, those aren't severe communication problems, those are actually trivial social quirks common in non-disabled people, and that there's therefore no possible way we could be considered autistic. And then she films and publishes public indignation meetings in which she complains about the articles featuring us as being a conspiratorial misinformation campaign that aims to promote public dislike of her autistic children, who we allegedly despise.
So this is what Spectrum News considers to be autism. This is, and we just heard it, sensory overload, communication, and difficulty expressing emotions. Okay, that describes a lot of people I know who don't have autism. So there are those quote unquote autistic doctors. Of course, I don't see a speck of autism in these people, but whatever, who have been antagonistic towards those who speak out on behalf of the severely affected. Kind of saying that we're not treating them with dignity, we're not treating them with respect, we're disparaging them, when all we're doing is communicating their reality. Like, it's inherently awful. Like, their existence is inherently awful to these people. Anyway, I won't elaborate on that too much. But what about another diagnosis for, these people who are so super functional, so super successful? They don't really have, severe social communication problems, because here they are, they're able to express very complicated thoughts. And what about another diagnosis? I mean, is there anything in the DSM? I mean, you guys are members of the APA, right? The American Psychiatric Association. I mean, is there anything in the book that could be applied instead of autism, some kind of personality disorder?
All while sneaky little Jill only reads a selected single-digit percentage of said articles to her audience, to be sure that she hides any contents which would risk presenting the high-functioning autistic people featured within them as actually being disabled or in any way sympathetic. And if you don't believe me, I've already spoken for over 15 fucking hours about it. You can watch my other videos on the Barrier Aggression playlist if you don't believe me, because I have the proof and the receipts. And in the comments of the Facebook message, which I sadly was not able to get screenshots of because I refused to make a Facebook account and won't let me scroll that far after the first time I read this, and fortunately took the screenshots that I did. But you could find comments from NCSA supporters responding to that official organization post, clamoring for the obsolete Asperger's disorder diagnosis from the DSM-4 to be reinstated, so that autistic people like me, and also very unlike me, who nonetheless happen to require less intense disability supports than those the NCSA feels a real autistic person should need, can all be evicted out of the autism space and reassigned with Asperger's disorder, as some of us might have been back under 1994 standards. They say that we, meaning people like me, aren't autistic and can't possibly be considered severely disabled because we don't have clinically significant communication problems, and that therefore they need to bring back Asperger's, an obsolete diagnosis from 1994, to cleanse our corrupting influence from the purity of the autism spectrum disorder definition that they want to reserve for those autistics they personally feel sympathetic for. But they're so full of shit, because they've brought into the exact misconception that the old Asperger's diagnosis was just a description of hyperfunctionality and quirky savant traits without any sense of impairment or disability. Asperger's syndrome itself was literally defined as a severe and sustained qualitatively clinically significant impairment in social communication, occupation, and other important areas of functioning. In the DSM-4 era, the main distinguishing factor between autism and Asperger's was that Asperger's didn't emphasize the observation of speech delay, and that there was enough overlap between Asperger's and autism that the Asperger's definition literally said to turn back to the autism definition and reread certain parts of it so they could save paper and ink by not reprinting verbatim portions of the autism definition for the Asperger's entry, with Asperger's being a disorder adjacent to autism, which along with autism was also categorized as a pervasive developmental disorder and not a non-pervasive, pointlessly pathologized description of being a goofy, non-disabled nerd, as Jill and so many NCSA allies like to imply, with Jill herself saying that we have TikTok autism.
This isn't TikTok autism. You have to have a developmental disability to qualify for services in this system, and we see this exponential curve.
And seemingly misusing California state-specific support program criteria to imply that people like me don't have neurodevelopmental disabilities, in spite of us literally being in the developmental disability diagnostic range. I know that Jill's point is probably that we shouldn't be in the developmental disability diagnostic range, but guess what? Jill isn't a fucking doctor, which is the whole thing she's accusing us of, saying that we can't call ourselves autistic because we aren't doctors, even though she doesn't even respect those of us who were called autistic by professional clinicians, which she isn't one of, let alone our personal... What the fuck is wrong with this person?
What the fuck is happening?
If these NCSA supporters were sincere about bringing back the Asperger's diagnosis for people like the ones in the article the NCSA linked to in that Facebook post, why don't they give a shit that the NCSA's whole point in that post was that the article allegedly didn't describe people with severe communication problems? That's the defining characteristic of Asperger's, yet they want to throw us into an obsolete diagnostic category that they themselves would not even think we belong in if that largely identical definition was presented to them as a description of autistic disorder rather than a description of Asperger's disorder, which they are convinced, on a consistent basis at least, isn't even a true disability. Because they don't care about bringing back Asperger's syndrome for the sake of restoring the sensible and clinically accurate diagnosis for disabled people like me. That's empty NCSA propaganda. Now, there may be some people who do sincerely feel that way, whether they're mistaken or not, but they are not here now, and I'm not discussing them, because these people that I'm discussing today don't see Asperger's as a diagnostic category of disability. They see it as a dumpster to toss us into because they think we're trash that's stealing the spotlight from their children. They want to bring back Asperger's syndrome as a literal ghetto diagnosis to separate us from the true disability community and to turn autism into a private semantic space reserved for people they have personal stake in presenting as sympathetic and that's deserving of supports, when disabled people themselves explain why that's bullshit these people hide behind their children and patients who reportedly can't even engage with these concepts, using their own autistic children and patients as human shields because they're fucking cowards. Now, I've spoken for at least 15 hours at this point, probably over 20 if you count my 2024 video about Buck Angel's interview with Amber. And all of my videos were in response to the parents and doctors of high support needs autistic children who think that advocating for their kids means presenting autistic people in need of less extensive supports as in one way or another being disability impersonators. And in all those hours, I never even once argued in support or defense of the legitimacy of the self-diagnosis of autism. Now, I did that not because I believe that clinical diagnosis of disabilities, of which I personally happen to have benefited, is the defining line between legitimate disability and fake disability, but because I believe that the arguments and claims made by these ideologically driven disability critics were so crucially flawed and insincere that even if I said nothing to challenge their opposition to self-identification of disability, that even their fundamental stated principle of passionately defending the scientific and academic legitimacy of real disabled people from insincere, facetious, self-diagnosed disability glamour chasers seeking online fame and attention or political clout would still be revealed as an elaborate farce used to dress up their organized disability bigotry as legitimate activism. And now, here we are. I mean, look how cautiously I was every time I made this accusation until now. I mean, heck, just look at me in my last video and the clip I played earlier in this video. I don't need to phrase this in the hypothetical anymore, because now all those times where I had to say that it seems like the NCSA treats clinical diagnosis of so-called high-functioning autism as a form of self-diagnosis, well, that thinking is strong enough among their members that someone in control of their Facebook account directly stated as much in public. As I argued in an earlier video, I believe it was part 12 of Barrier Aggression, towards the end, I was so confused when Lee Wachtel did an NCSA-hosted presentation in which she argued against the ongoing clinical recognition of so-called high-functioning autism in the DSM-5 by complaining that these people shouldn't be allowed to choose their own diagnosis.
Unfortunately, we live in a world that has become very PC, and everyone is fearful of being canceled or being lambasted on social media. And oftentimes we can find ourselves in a situation of blind acceptance of identity over reality, which again is so frustrating because nowhere else in medicine do we experience the same. And again, these diagnoses are important because diagnoses dictate assessment, they dictate treatment, they dictate research, they dictate investigations. Patients with other issues don't get to choose their diagnosis. You don't get to choose what stage or grade of cancer you have. You don't get to choose your blood pressure, or your laboratory values. You want your sodium level to be something. And no patient in his right mind would argue that that's how it should be. No cancer patient would want to grade or stage his own tumor based on his personal preference or his feelings or his identity, because that cancer patient wants to get the most accurate diagnosis that leads to a gold standard treatment and the best outcome. And you'd have to ask, would any physician go along with this? Of course not. Correct diagnoses allow for equitable access to critical things, services, both now and long term, funding. There are very few people who are able to pay out of pocket for necessary services, personalized and specialized treatment and interventions, research and advocacy.
But with this Facebook post, it all makes perfect sense now, seeing as the NCSA is willing to state that they consider professional diagnosis of autism in the high-functioning range to be a form of self-identification if the person in question is able to communicate an account of their own experiences absent of the control of NCSA members and allies. But even with this NCSA Facebook post saying that the professional diagnosis of autism can somehow count as self-identification of autism if they so decree it, it's so fucking weird watching the NCSA panelist Carmen Lopez Arvizu describe high-functioning autism as a personal theory proposed by neurodiversity proponents, which I guess autistic self-advocates need to let go of and accept alternative theories.
We need to start talking about bias and to make sure that we share that with everyone, that there needs to be more inclusive opinions, that there needs to be inclusion of opinions that might not be necessarily supportive of your theory, but that we need to have a conversation and a civilized conversation, not when one of the parties is afraid to speak because being afraid of being your career destroyed, because that is the reality of things. People are afraid to talk.
NCSA's own president, time and time again, present what she calls high-functioning autism as some sort of insurgent phenomenon of the social media era that was forced into the DSM-5 thanks to faulty logic that would have never been accepted as scientifically legitimate in past decades when autism was supposedly a real disability.
I'm just going to start off with a little bit of historical perspective. So I follow autism research very, very closely. I've been reading autism research like the hyper geek that I am since 2000, earliest 2000s. But if you go back into the literature, this is not hard to find. 1988, for example, Fred Volkmar in the New England Journal of Medicine writes a paper about autism, and he calls it a, quote, devastating disorder. But then you go like to today, and all of a sudden there's this quote unquote new understanding of autism. I mean, I can go on with dozens and dozens of examples to prove that autism was considered a very serious and often devastating developmental disorder. So let's fast forward. Here we are today, and we're in this mess where this one word is supposed to do so much heavy lifting that it means, kids like mine who are nonverbal and have capacities of maybe toddlers or preschoolers, to somebody who is a PhD, to somebody who is a doctor, to somebody who is a lawyer, right? To somebody for whom autism is a challenge, right? But not really a developmental disorder or neurodevelopmental disorder. So this is what Spectrum News considers to be autism. This is, and we just heard it, sensory overload, communication, and difficulty expressing emotions. Okay, that describes a lot of people I know who don't have autism. So this is what I want to pose to you guys.
And that's not what Cantor initially describes. Autism is
most definitely not.
I'm not saying. Unfortunately, it just really bears no semblance to what autism was when it was initially described by Cantor, when it was studied in the 70s by Rudder, and all the research that we have on autism is not what currently people are terming autism. And that does do a disservice to those who have, I guess, more classic or more true forms of autism.
And it's so weird seeing this because, emphatically, that's not correct. Accounts of the history of autism, with zero ideological connection or loyalty to promoting the neurodiversity paradigm, know that descriptions of people with clinically significant impairments that were scientifically and academically understood to reflect autism, people who, as a part of their description of autism, also happen to have significantly less support needs than others, but were still considered autistic. That is, autistic people who, by some, might be considered non-severe or high-functioning, have been part of the history of autism for generations prior to the DSM-5 in 2013, which, according to Jill Escher and her allies at the NCSA, is when the autism definition went haywire and started including non-disabled people like me. Now, high-functioning autism, of course, is not a renegade invention of chronically online amateur autism revisionists, and neurodiversity activists forcing the idea down the throat of the disability world as part of a social justice crusade. The evidence and proof is out there, and it's really easy to come by, like in this clip right here, which I've already played a number of times in my series to this point.
I've met a lot of adults with autism who are now in their, I'd say, 40s, 50s, even in their 60s. There aren't many of them. You're a very vanishingly small population. But I meet a lot of very, very high-functioning adults who were diagnosed, back in the day when we were told only people who were diagnosed with autism, were the most severe cases. And unless they emphatically, that's not correct. I mean, Temple Grandin was not a very severe case. You're not a very severe case. Jonathan Mitchell's not a very severe case. I could think of 4 or 5 people I've met here in the Bay Area who are not very severe cases, who were diagnosed in the 70s. So I think it's a little, it concerns me that, we're sort of saying, well, high-functioning autism was missed. Like, oh, no, not really. I'm not sure if we actually have proof of that, but that's neither here nor there. I'm just making a side observation. Now, how did you get involved in autism advocacy? Because here you were.
Throughout the previous 15 videos in this series, I have frequently been using this clip from a different podcast as proof that high-functioning autism wasn't something invented by facetious non-disabled kids on TikTok and Tumblr who wanted to hijack autism as a trendy identity to validate their fantasies of seeming special or gifted, or of being part of a minority plagued by struggle and persecution. And every time I use this clip in my series, I was very explicit about the fact that I had edited the clip from its original form to avoid distracting from the wider point that I was making in that moment, and I repeatedly promised to discuss this clip in its original, unaltered form by the end of my series. Well, it's time to discuss the source of that audio clip and present it in its original, unaltered form and original context. Here it is.
Well, I want to say something. I've been around the autism world quite a long time. I've met a lot of adults with autism who are now in their, I would say, 40s, 50s, even in their 60s. There aren't many of them. You're a very vanishingly small population. But I meet a lot of very, very high-functioning adults who were diagnosed, back in the day when we were told the only people who were diagnosed with autism, were the most severe cases. And I want to say emphatically, that's not correct. I mean, Temple Grandin was not a very severe case. You're not a very severe case. Jonathan Mitchell's not a very severe case. I could think of, 4 or 5 people I've met here in the Bay Area who are not very severe cases, who were diagnosed in the 70s. So I think it's a little, it concerns me that, we're sort of saying, well, high-functioning autism was missed. Like, well, no, not really. I'm not sure if we actually have proof of that. But that's neither here nor there. I'm just making a side observation. Now, how did you get involved in autism advocacy? Because here you were, this guy who found out he had autism. Like, how old were you? You were
right. Well, I've mentioned
maybe?
This on every. I think just about every podcast I've done. They've asked me that, and I've told them the same story. I was looking for answers.
Holy shit!
Jill, that was you. You said that, Jill Escher. You said it to Temple Grandin's autistic friend Tom McKean, who you managed to secure as a repeat guest panelist on your shitty fucking podcast. So that either means that you're a tookus magookus schmuck that's willing to lie your ass off by falsely legitimizing the history of high-functioning autism, as some may call it, just so you can suck up to the high-functioning autistic friend of a highly respected and world-famous autistic person like Temple Grandin, who you value as an ally of your National Council on Severe Autism.
Temple Grandin, Temple Grandin, Temple Grandin, Temple Grandin, and certainly Temple Grandin.
Or it means you're willing to lie your ass off about autistics you consider non-severe cases by teaming up with alleged autism experts to defame high-functioning autism as a hoax category of non-disabled identitarian ideologues who thrive in luxury and privilege while stealing and concealing the suffering of your truly autistic children. It can't be both. Which is it, Jill? Either way, you, Jill, are completely full of shit, and your friends like Amy and Jackie and several others who I will not name, who I sincerely don't believe to be fucked up, at least not at this point, are either going to have to explicitly out themselves as your disability bigot dunce stooges, or realize that they might have been too busy actually trying to help high support needs autistic people, and perhaps deal with irrational keyboard warriors who post stupid shit like this, to realize that they may have entrusted the goodwill and reputation of the NCSA to someone they perhaps didn't fully understand. Someone who, in my opinion, thinks that avenging the suffering of her autistic children means punishing any unrelated autistic stranger that she perceives as living a fuller or better life than her own kids. But that's a discussion for next time in part 16 of Barrier Aggression. I'll see you all later, and thanks for watching.